that you're using, and what that does is it gets the vegetables submerged, and the submersion protects them from aerobic organisms, although any of you who've tried this at home know that the surface is the place where problems can happen, where it comes into contact with a flow of oxygen. So earlier I saw how many of you are fermenting at home. How many of you have ever had some like funky aerobic growth develop on the surface of your ferments? Oh, funny, almost everyone. So, I mean, I get emails all the time from people who feel deflated when this happens to them. They throw away their fermenting vegetables because they think that something's gone terribly awry. But this is just like a normal part of the process. You know, I mean, increasingly people are engineering clever systems to protect the surface from oxygen. But, you know, this has just been part of the process always. You know, what I like to do is just get in there and skim off the funky surface growth as best I can. I can't always get all of it. Sometimes a little bit of it dissipates into the juice. It's completely harmless. Like there's nothing to worry about. I'll be honest with you. I mean, you know, when Wild Fermentation came out, I had like 10 years of fermentation experience, and I'd been doing that. I'd read that it was okay to do that, but I always had a little bit of a question, like, is it really okay for everybody? And for years, I was expecting like somebody to raise their hand at a workshop and say like, well, I did what you said. I scraped away the funky growth on the surface. It was fine for me, but I have this cousin who has extreme mold sensitivities, and I kept waiting for someone to say that they had witnessed somebody reacting in some way to the funky growth on top of the vegetables, and I have yet to ever hear a story like that, and it really confirms for me. I don't know, like the safety of this, and that you don't have to worry about that. If it freaks you out, I mean, there's certainly effective strategies for protecting the surface from oxygen. I've tried a bunch of them. As it's ended up, I never use any of them because I am compulsively interested in smelling and tasting my ferments. And if you're opening it up every couple of days, you're defeating the purpose of your cleverly engineered system for protecting the surface from oxygen. So I just contend with the funky surface growth, and I just don't worry about it. But if you find yourself just profoundly disturbed, I mean, there are a lot of very clever gadgets and technologies that people have been coming up with that do effectively protect the surface from oxygen. One thing that's been just super interesting to me is getting a chance to travel and sort of see different examples of fermentation around the world. And, it seems like fermentation is close to universally practiced. I mean, I certainly don't have encyclopedic knowledge of every culinary tradition in the world, but I have yet to come up with any examples of culinary traditions that don't incorporate any kind of or that don't incorporate some kind of fermentation. And the practices, the products of fermentation around the world are really quite varied. But it's just sort of it's given rise to this question for me, like, how did this come about? How did every different culinary tradition around the world develop ways of working with the microorganisms that they didn't even specifically know were on their food? And I think that the answer is the fact that all of our food has microorganisms on it. So, except in the case of dried foods, the microorganisms are going to begin to do something to the food. And so, they will decompose the food. They will make the food rot. They will make the food spoil unless we figure out how to create conditions that enable them to elevate the food. So I think that, the answer to the question of, why is fermentation so universally practiced? Why is fermentation everywhere? Is the simple fact that everything we eat, all plants, all animal products, are populated by elaborate communities of microorganisms. And, just through our powers of observation and trial and error, people in all different parts of the world learned lessons about under what conditions would the food decompose into something disgusting that nobody would ever want to put into their mouths, versus under what conditions would the food become more delicious, more digestible, less toxic. And so, people learn these things. And then, because, there have always been migrations, this information spreads, and, cultures influence one another. And, fermentation really is a global phenomenon. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege to travel for a couple of weeks in China with a Chinese American friend and her Chinese mother, it was just incredible to see the amount of, especially once we got into sort of a remote village, which was where people were living a more or less subsistence life, just the range of ferments that people were practicing in their home kitchens was, just incredibly inspiring. And if any of you are interested in learning more about Chinese fermentation, I just want to plug these a series of videos that we made about our trip, and we posted on YouTube, and you can find, they're called People's Republic of Fermentation. And they're on my YouTube channel, Sandor Katz. It's 8 more or less 10-minute videos, each focusing on a different kind of fermented food. But it's incredible. Like, all around the world, there are just varied and inspiring examples of fermentation. And really what got me interested in Chinese fermentation is that all of the literature about sauerkraut points to China as the origin of sauerkraut. And the story is just told over and over again in the literature that the nomadic people of Central Asia encountered fermented cabbage in China, and then carried the techniques, westward into Europe, where it became sauerkraut. Just this morning, Cheryl and I were having a conversation about fermenting pesto, basil. So at the end of the season, I harvest whatever basil is left on my basil plants. I don't add the olive oil, but I chop up like basil and garlic. I salt it. I ferment it just as if it was a sauerkraut. And then when I'm ready to make some pesto, I add some olive oil and some nuts and grind it up into a paste. So, I mean, there's all kinds of, practical benefits of it in terms of enjoying my garden and getting to enjoy my garden for a longer period of time. So, I mean, there's just... there's so many ways that I continue to feel energized by fermentation, continue to feel like I benefit from fermentation. This friend of mine, like a Cherokee friend of mine from North Carolina, showed up at my place last year with buckets of ramps. Do you guys have ramps up here? Okay, so ramps are these like wild alliums, and in my own experience, like I know a couple places around where I live where I can pick them, but I can get a handful, and I'll make an omelet or something with the ramps. But my friend Tyson showed up with like several 5-gallon buckets full of ramps, and I made ramp kraut, It is so delicious. It is, I mean, it has such I don't even know how, it's like, it's hard. There's not really great vocabulary to describe flavors, but it just has such a like beautiful, subtle, complex flavor. That might be my favorite ferment that I've ever made. I don't know. But, also a lot of ferments, I mean, no fermentation is rocket science. Like anybody here who's interested in any realm of fermentation, like you can make your own cheese, you can make your own bread, you can make your own beer, you can make your own wine. But, there's technique to all these things. And the first time you make these things is not going to be the best bread you've ever had in your life or the best cheese that you've ever had in your life. And so, so there's a lot of technique. I built a mud brick oven, a mud bread oven a couple of years ago. So it's really been forcing me to like up my bread game. And so I've been making bread pretty regularly. I met this a Swiss guy from a family that's been rye farmers for generations, and he gave me some great pointers on making fermenting all rye bread that I've been doing pretty regularly. But I mean, I would say that like, with the breads, like sometimes I'll have a batch where it's like, wow, this is the best one that I've ever made. And then like, the next week I'll make one and it's like, oh, I don't know what I did differently, but this one's just not quite as good as last week's one. So, certain of these things where there's just so much technique involved, I'm still learning the technique. Yeah.